and go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Belfast Garden Club presentation, Preventing and Addressing Plant Diseases in the Garden with Caleb Goossen, crop specialist from the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners. I'm Brenda Harrington, program librarian at the Belfast Free Library. And the library has been pleased to host the daytime lecture series with the Belfast Garden Club again this year. And again, it's virtual, but it's been working out really well. So we continue to do it. I want to let you know about an upcoming program. The library is co-sponsoring an evening lecture series with the Belfast Garden Club with topics that focus on the effects of the climate crisis on our forests, farms, and gardens. The next program is a week from today on Tuesday, February 22nd at 6:30 with a program titled Growing Food and Ornamentals in a Changing Climate with speakers Haley Jean and Sarah Kelman, Masters of Science students from the University of Maine School of Food and Agriculture. To register for the Zoom link for this program, please go to the belfastlibrary.org/ABCD events or the Belfast Garden Club's website, belfastgardenclub.org. So thank you all for joining us. And before I turn the mic over to Corliss Davis from the Garden Club to introduce today's speaker, I want to remind everyone to please keep your mics muted and let you know the program is being recorded and will be available on the library's YouTube channel within a day or two. So anyway, with that, thank you so much. And Corliss, take it away.
Thank you very much, Brenda, and thanks again to the library for all their support for this series. We're very grateful for everything you do for us. I'd also like to ask anyone who has questions for Caleb during the program to please put them in the chat. He is willing to answer some questions during his talk if there's something very urgent you'd like to have answered. Otherwise, Susan Kennard, my co-chair on the program committee of the Garden Club, will be reading back the questions to Caleb at the end of his presentation. So as Brenda mentioned, Caleb is the MOFGA crop specialist, so we're very glad to have him with us today. He has a bachelor's degree in plant biology and sustainable agriculture from Hampshire College, and he recently completed his PhD from the University of Vermont. While he was in Vermont, he farmed organic vegetables for 9 years before he started graduate school. And he also has experience with organic heirloom seed production and organic orchard maintenance on farms in New Zealand. Caleb, we're ready to listen.
Thank you. So I guess I will start sharing my screen to give us something to look at here. I tend to be fairly informal, but I also tend to try to pack too much into a talk. So it'll be a little balance of me trying to get through things quickly enough, but also trying to give a little room, which is why it's nice if questions can wait, but I certainly want to clarify anything that may need clarifying. We can just start off here. This is probably a somewhat familiar picture for folks. This is my own garden. I don't live that far away from Belfast, and this was this past summer. And you can see there is a little disease on those cherry tomatoes. That's early blight. And I did a little bit to prevent it. I staked up those plants. And in terms of that, that's where my intervention stopped, because cherry tomatoes are very vigorous growers. I kept an eye on the disease pressure. And that's part of the organic strategy, right? Is you need to pick your battles. And I knew that this crop was going to continue yielding no matter what. So when talking about diseases, I actually borrow this slide from my predecessor, Eric Seidman. He created this to talk about pests, but it's sort of a similar way we think about things, that in our growing year, most of our diseases or pests are in a survival stage, or they've completely left the region, right? Whatever was living here is dead and they're living somewhere else where it's warmer and they can survive, or they're in a survival stage, an overwintering stage of some sort. Then in the spring, things warm up. There are plants available to infect, and plants are really growing. That's when secondary cycles in terms of the disease reproducing, and that's when it can really spread and take off. And then in terms of control, you have to also think about then the autumn, like I was saying, I'm not so worried about that crop of cherry tomatoes, but you do have to be thinking about how is that infected material potentially overwintering and might affect the following year's crop. Because if you have a lot that's surviving the winter, that's a lot larger infection potential for the spring. And if you start with a large number here on the cycle, then that replication secondary cycle means that your large number gets exponentially larger. If you start with only a little bit, then you have a slower growth. So we have a couple areas where we're really going to probably want to focus our attention and our thoughts of where we might manage things. One is what is overwintered and how can we prevent it from being a large initial population? And then following, how can we make that job easier for the following season? So one of the plant pathology concepts that I think really is helpful is what's called the disease triangle. And that is just the notion that you need 3 factors in order for a disease to take hold. You need a host that is susceptible to the disease. You need the actual pathogen to be present. And you need a conducive environment for that pathogen to do the infection, to be able to infect successfully. If you only have 2 of these, then you're only at risk of disease. You really need all 3. And, almost painfully obvious example would be if you're not growing tomatoes, you don't have to worry about any of the tomato diseases, even if they're there, right? You may have the environment that's conducive to the tomato disease. You may have the tomato disease, but if you just take a year off growing them, you will not have tomato disease. So that also is one of our first places that we'll look at in terms of management, prevention and management and control, if we can, is how to manage our hosts so that it's less susceptible. Assuming you for example, still want to grow your tomatoes. It really starts with variety selection. I like this picture because it shows many different seed catalogs. I tend to grow from many different seed suppliers. But today I will focus a little bit on the Johnny's catalog just because pretty much all of us know it and they offer some really nice information. So for this example, we'll look at cabbage and we zoom in. And I put a little red box here around their disease resistance codes. And they're just giving you their abbreviations, BR for black rot, DM for downy mildew, etc. Oops, sorry. If we look at this one variety here, it has a high resistance to FY, which is fusarium yellows. So if you've had troubles with fusarium yellows in your garden before, you would maybe want to consider this variety, just purely for the knowledge that it's going to have a high resistance, it's going to be less susceptible. Whereas if you've had black rot, that's this IRBR abbreviation here, that means that this variety has intermediate resistance. It's going to fend off black rot. So if you know you've had really, really high pressure, this maybe wouldn't be your first choice if you could find a variety that had high resistance. But if this was the only variety you could find with any resistance at all, it's going to do much better than any other variety that has no resistance to black rot. So the first one is really just looking for that genetic resistance that's been bred into these plants. And that could be coming through in any matter of traits that they've been selected for that make them less resistant, or sorry, less susceptible, more resistant. And then, of course, that also goes hand in hand with just having healthy crops. And I think I don't need to dwell on this too much. I know anybody who wants to garden wants to have healthy crops. That's something you're already aiming for, but it is one of those things that it gets brought up. It's a little tricky to talk about because I think sometimes people find disease and they assume I'm not doing enough for soil fertility. And that could be that could be the case, but it also isn't necessarily, correlation isn't necessarily causation. But if you have one healthy plant growing next to a less healthy plant, you tend to see the disease show up on the less healthy plant first. That isn't to say if you had all healthy plants of one species that a disease couldn't still take hold given the right circumstances. So then pathogen presence. This is another one that it feels painfully obvious, but at the same time, we all forget it. We all forget, and we maybe get worried. And you know, I have folks asking me about what to do about late blight, and most of the time, late blight is not around Maine for most of the growing season. And so the answer is don't do anything about late blight. Maybe do general practices that reduce the chances of diseases, but that would be for all diseases. Don't do anything specific for late blight until it's in the area, and then maybe you want to consider some actions. And this is particularly something to keep in mind if you're talking with somebody who wants to use a fungicide to prevent disease. You know, even the organic ones, you don't want to spray anything you don't have to. So it's better to go in a controlled manner, you know, and really only do it when it's going to have an impact. So in talking about disease presence or pathogen presence, this is why crop rotation is so important for many of our gardens. It can be a little tricky in a small garden scale. I mean, if you only have a 10 by 20 garden, you can only rotate your tomatoes so far from where they were last year. So it may not actually have that much impact on a above ground disease, but if it's a root disease that lives in the soil and it's specific to that type of crop, it's very important. And then people can get a little creative. You could maybe have that one garden that's in front of your house and the one garden that's in back of your house. And you may actually see some benefits of rotating between them. And similarly, you can rotate in time as well as space. Maybe you take a year off from growing onions and instead you grow extra squash and you work with a friend and they grow your onions and you grow their squash. There are other ways to get creative about crop rotation. This is a little bit as to what we're thinking about when we're thinking about crop rotation. Please don't try to read this figure. It's far too detailed. You can't read those words, but this is a sort of family tree for all the flowering plants. The big division is monocots. That'd be like grasses, bananas, palm trees, those kinds of that family. Sorry, it's larger than a family, that group. And then dicots, and those would be our broad-leaved plants. And if we think about in a vegetable garden anyway, alliums are a monocot. And I imagine many of you have ornamental gardens as well. This would be all your flowering bulbs, irises, lilies, they're all monocots. And then like brassicas. And so you can see a brassica plant is very genetically different than an allium plant, an onion plant. They have split off in that evolutionary tree a long time ago. So a disease that specializes in brassicas is really well adapted to infect brassicas and thrive and reproduce and send out a lot more spores to continue to infect brassicas. Maybe isn't well suited to do that to an onion. There are some generalist diseases that can infect all plants, but when we're worried about crop rotation, it's because we're trying to really separate out those crop specific diseases. And we tend to do it by plant families. So an allium is in the subfamily of I think Amaryllidaceae, maybe. Don't quote me on that. Brassicas, they are their own family, Brassicaceae. Beets are chenopods. They're actually in the Amaranthaceae. They are more closely related to brassicas than brassicas are to alliums, right? That's how this map is kind of read. The closer they are together, the more closely related. Whereas your nightshades are pretty different. Nightshades being peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes. Carrots are way down here, etc. So that's why we kind of break things up by plant families. Good weed control is very important in terms of weeds also fall into those same plant families. And a disease may be able to overwinter in a weed population and then infect a crop from that weed. The other aspect is more environmental, and we'll talk about that later, but just think of it in terms of weeds block airflow. Good sanitation, and that's kind of a vague term, but really it just means removing things that no longer need to be there and could be food for pathogens, right? So dead plant material in many ways is good to build up your soil organic matter, act as a mulch, but you just want to think about, is this alternaria that I'm worried about on my tomato plants then living on that dead leaf and overwintering on that dead leaf? Could I do a little better job cleaning up the garden, putting it into a compost bin where it's maybe going to decompose and have to compete with other organisms that are going to outcompete it, hopefully. And then barriers is one that I think we often don't think about in terms of organic disease management. But this could be something like high tunnel growing, you know, when folks, if anybody has a greenhouse or a high tunnel in their garden, I know not all of us are there. I don't have one. I'd love one in my garden, but some folks have been able to make that plunge. And anytime you are creating a barrier to the rain, you're also preventing spore fall from landing onto the plants, at least reducing it. So many of these diseases spread as spores in the air, and they actually fall out of the air. If you have a roof over the plants, they don't fall directly on them, and then they get washed into the soil elsewhere, as well as controlling the environment. And then another specific example with barriers is for bacterial wilt. If you've ever had your zucchinis or your summer squash or your cucumbers look like they're thriving one day, and then within a week all look like that, wilted and sad, there are a couple potential causes, but one of the most common issues is a disease called bacterial wilt, and that bacteria is spread almost entirely by these little striped cucumber beetles, and it lives in their stomachs and it overwinters inside that beetle. So if you can prevent the beetle from feeding on the plants, especially when they're younger and more susceptible, you can really stave off that bacterial wilt disease for a much longer time. So another picture from my garden, you know, there's row covers, spun bond polyester, things like Rime is one brand that people know. And those we often use for frost protection, but they also can be used to exclude insects. This is an exclusion netting. This is called Protect Net is the brand. It's expensive, but it can be durable and it can last a long time. So this is one way that I excluded cucumber beetles and squash bugs. It has that benefit. It excludes other things from the crop until it got big enough to be a little more resilient. When squash have at least a couple fully mature leaves, they've gotten to a physiological stage where they're better able to resist that bacterial disease. And honestly, unless you need pollinators to have access to pollinate the flowers when they start opening, you can just leave the row cover on as long as it's not too hot underneath it. And then the next step that I like to say for organic disease management is know what you have. This picture, you can chime in the chat. Does this look familiar to anybody? Do your first tomatoes on your plant look like this? I get pictures where people are saying, is this late blight? Is this early blight? Here's another picture of the same condition. And here it is on peppers. It tends to show up on the side wall of a pepper. And yeah, somebody already ID'd it in the chat. It's blossom end rot. And that is a physiological condition. It's not a disease. Fungicide is not going to help you in this situation. And this is a tangent, but adding calcium is also not going to help you in this situation, even though this is caused by the plant not being able to get calcium where it needs to fast enough. Just even water management is the best thing, as well as letting the plant get big enough before it bears fruit so that it has a big enough root system to supply that fruit. It's the rapid development of fruit without a good root supply of calcium to that fruit that causes this disorder. Here's another one. this one throws off everybody. And it looks like a disease. This is actually caused by this little leaf hopper, and that's called hopper burn. And what happens is that as that leaf hopper feeds on the plant, it actually injects a toxin, and the plant exports that toxin to the leaf margins, and that's why they die back. And the leaf hoppers do not overwinter here. They always come up from the Gulf of Mexico, and you never know if it's going to be a bad year or a not so bad year. This is when I'm going to throw some links in the chat. The first one, I believe, is to the pest report. If you're not familiar with it, I produce the pest report about once every 2 weeks, and you can sign up. It's just an email. You can ignore it if you want, but it just gives you a little hint of, informed by conversations I have with extension folks all around the Northeast. We talk about what pests and diseases are coming and when, and it just kind of helps to give people a heads up. Here's another example. I'm a little heavy on the abiotic conditions here. This is not a disease. This is somebody that let their garlic get too hot while it was curing. So this is called waxy breakdown. This is another one where it's actually hail damage. I was called out. I looked at this crop, and it looks a lot like a disease called Botrytis leaf blight, but it's hail damage. And we figured that out by figuring out that it hit plants from one side that a storm had passed by, blowing in that direction, and the other side of the leaves were totally unharmed. This, however, might look a little similar from a distance. This is a disease called onion downy mildew, and how you manage this really depends on the fact that you recognize that it's onion downy mildew. It's not Botrytis leaf blight. And so a lot of these things we don't have time to get into now, right? But it's about identifying the actual disease you're seeing and then looking at what needs to be done to prevent that. And then back to our disease triangle, where we're able to have the most control, right? We already did our susceptible host. We tried to have the strongest plant we can available, with some disease resistance bred into it. The pathogen presence, we have very little control over. I mentioned barriers are essentially the only time you can really influence that, by preventing a vector such as the cucumber beetles, or maybe preventing diseases coming in, maybe. So that leaves our only management strategies beyond that to be influencing the environment so that it's not conducive, so that we're only in that we have a susceptible host, we have a pathogen present, and therefore we're in that risky stage, and we're trying to manage this environment so that that pathogen can't take hold. Or even if it starts to take hold, maybe it can't thrive and become an outbreak. You know, a little bit of early blight is pretty much guaranteed in every single tomato garden all around Maine. I don't think I've ever seen a tomato garden without at least a little bit of early blight. But can you manage it at just that presence versus a full-on concerning outbreak? So one good example of how an environment really changes things or not is Botrytis. Botrytis is one of those generalists. You can see by the number of crops here, it doesn't care what family it's on. It is also pretty much omnipresent. We always have Botrytis spores in our environment. You can't rotate away from it. You can't exclude it. It's there. But we don't always see it in our gardens. Sometimes that's just because we don't recognize, you know, like these dead leaf blossom, or sorry, tomato blossoms here. That was probably Botrytis infecting the flower. And sometimes your strawberries look great. Sometimes you get furry, you know, gross strawberries. That is because Botrytis spores will only germinate and infect their host if there is a film of moisture for 8 to 12 hours or very high relative humidity for that similar length of time. And that's if the temperatures are within this range. If you had a film of moisture on the leaf surface for longer than that, and you may be able to get infection outside of that temperature range, but the disease does best in this temperature range in wet conditions. So for a greenhouse grower, they try to maybe keep their greenhouse above 75 degrees at least 12 hours of the time of the day, right? Or maybe higher. So during the sunlight hours, making sure that leaves have time to dry, making sure that humidity around the plant is never allowed to build up that much. And that's what a lot of this boils down to. You'll notice I linked a article I wrote for MOFGA about sort of modifying the environment in our garden to try to make it less hospitable to disease. And it really all boils down to most of these diseases need water or at least high humidity to cause that infection. And then, so some background information. I am going to try to, in the interest of time, breeze through this a little bit, but just so you know, there's different ways that both fungi on the left, this series of pictures is going to be fungi on the left and bacteria on the right. They can enter plants through wounds. That's why we try to, minimize broken parts of the plant and have clean cuts whenever possible that are going to callus over quickly. Because that's a direct entrance that's easier for something to invade through stomata. And I imagine a lot of gardeners may know what stomata are, but they're the little tiny holes in the leaf that let air exchange happen, right? That's how the plant gets carbon dioxide, releases oxygen. And here in this scanning electron photograph, micrograph, you see here's probably a spore, a fungal spore. Here's one that's germinated and the mycelia are going right in. They're trying to infect that plant. And here's a closer up picture. I just love that we actually have the ability to take these pictures. Somebody has the ability to take these pictures. So this is sometimes how, your powdery mildew, your downy mildew may start. And it needs, if you think about this spore landing here, it needs enough water to be able to grow that far out without drying out. The outdoors in the summer is actually a pretty harsh environment. And if it's dry, we see much less disease because these spores may land, but they can't survive long enough to infect necessarily. This is another one. If you think about the morning dew, oftentimes that is dew, that's condensation. But also a lot of the time it's guttation. One of my favorite words, I'll throw it into the chat, but it is when the plant has too much water pressure, it has specialized organs in the leaves that help expel some of that water. And so here's water coming out of the hydothodes on a broccoli plant leaf and early morning. And you can see on the top of the leaf, that's probably actual dew, but the rest here on the sides, that's guttation. And that's fine, as the sun, it always happens, especially when it's been wetter. And it happens overnight because the plant doesn't have sun and photosynthesis to use up the water that's in its leaf and to cause a lot of evaporation of water out of the leaf. As soon as that starts happening, as soon as the sun starts getting this leaf going, it's going to photosynthesize, it's going to need water. It can actually suck that water droplet back into the leaf. And now if there's a bacteria or fungi in that water droplet, it's going back in as well. And so black rot in cabbage, if you notice, it's a bacterial disease. It often shows up on the leaf margins right here, and that's how it gets in. And that's why if you have a little bit of black rot, you don't want to go walking through by this plant and then walking past your other brassica plants early in the morning when they have that water right there, because then it can get into the hydothode and infect those leaves as well. That's how it becomes spread. Is often it's us that are moving it. So if you do have black rot, it's the kind of thing that you just need to think about. When is the spread least conducive? Early afternoon, dry, there's no water hanging on the hydothode. And even if you move that bacteria, hopefully it dries out before it can infect the plant. And then the last one is direct penetration. And that's something only fungi can do. Bacteria haven't figured this out, or they just can't live long enough. Maybe in a wet enough condition, they can do this. But in terms of like a leaf surface where we expect things to dry out eventually, only fungi can grow and produce essentially digestive enzymes to digest their way through a leaf and infect that way. However, it's going to take them a bit of energy and to do that. And if they dry out before they can do it, it's not going to happen. So this is just another schematic of how that's actually working. This is a lot of work for that fungal spore to get there, and it needs water. The other thing is if you have modified that leaf surface with a fungicide of any kind, I talk about organic control, but this is the same way chemical fungicides work as well for the most part, is that they're modifying that leaf surface. So as that spore germinates, it hits whatever it is that's causing it to either die or not be able to grow the way it normally would. So that could be in organic controls, a bacterial product, a beneficial bacteria that we know we're applying, or it could be a sulfur fungicide or a copper fungicide or a horticultural oil, where those are essentially creating a leaf surface that the spore cannot get through or can't survive well. Powdery mildew is a good example of this. It's pretty much ubiquitous. You can't rotate away. I did see a question about powdery mildew and, our ornamental crops. It is pretty common to see powdery mildews in our ornamental crops, and then our vegetable crops. And this combination of pictures I like for a couple of reasons. One, powdery mildew is highly species specific, and there's many different species of powdery mildew. So the powdery mildew that's on this bee balm is a totally different species than the powdery mildew that's on that squash. You can have powdery mildew on the bee balm, it's not going to infect the squash. However, it is telling you that the environment in your garden is conducive to powdery mildew if it's there. So if powdery mildew in the neighboring area, the species that can infect squash starts blowing in the wind, you should know that there's potential it could infect your plant. The other reason I like this picture, and again, this is from my own garden, but when I moved to a new house, you can see that soil looks pretty rough. It was the first year of that being a garden, having been like post-construction. So pretty low soil health. The butternut squash, which is the one on the top left, has maybe a little bit of powdery mildew infection, but that species is much less susceptible to powdery mildew than, and diseases in general, than zucchini, which is the plant on the bottom right. So you can see that's that susceptible host difference or not. They're both types of squash, but they're actually different squash species. So know what your disease is, because knowing that you see like powdery mildew in the area, you have to then know, okay, it's powdery mildew. It's not downy mildew. Very common to say one versus the other. And I sometimes trip up and I say downy mildew when I mean powdery mildew, or vice versa. But you have to know which one it is, because what products are going to work for either is going to maybe vary. And then facilitating rapid drying, which is really that modifying the environment. And here's just some screen captures of that link, of that article I linked to. And we will get right now to tomatoes, because it's just a really nice example. Here's tomatoes from my own garden. You can see I do a basket weave to keep them upright so that they get a little better airflow. And you can see the suckers starting to come out. Here's one, some other ones. Those are all ones that I remove. And if you compare that area of the photo on the left and the area of the photo on the right, you can see a lot more ground on the one on the right, which means there's a lot less density of leaves, and just airflow is going to be better. The plant is going to dry out faster. The relative humidity around those leaves is going to be just a touch lower. Sometimes, in a really bad wet year, it maybe doesn't make a difference, but in a so-so year, it does make a difference. It also, there are other reasons why you may want to prune your tomatoes. What I like to do for most tomato varieties is look for my first flowering cluster, what's going to be the first fruit cluster. The plant tends to make the sucker below that very vigorous. It's already innate in the plant that it's going to want to let that go off as a sucker, a second leader. And so I prune off everything below that. And somebody is mentioning about, is this partially why to water from below and not from above? And yes, that's exactly why you want, and that's also why you may want to change what time of day you're watering. The absolute best time to water, I get this question a lot, is early morning. If you think about it, the plants are maybe already wet. Some of these spores you actually are going to wash off. You can't guarantee or promise that you'll wash off all of them, but there's a chance you'll wash some of them off. But that plant was already wet, that leaf was already wet, and the natural time to dry was, you're not going to increase the time it takes for that leaf to dry any longer than it probably already would have, except maybe, a tiny bit. So if you can do it before sunrise, maybe set a timer. Garden hose timers are great. Otherwise, sometime it's going to be rapidly drying. Early afternoon is great, or mid-afternoon, not so late in the evening that night is going to fall, dew is going to fall, and then the leaf just stays wet all night. Then you've just expanded the amount of time that the leaves stay wet and given diseases more of a chance to take hold. And then biological control. There's some instances where it's possible. Right now, I lump this into the usually doesn't hurt category, but it's hard to rely on some of these products. It's hard to know that you can rely on them. And I hope that over the coming years, we're going to find a lot more valuable information. I hope there's good research that will be done, but a lot of products making a lot of claims, and there's a little bit of, you never know. Botanical fungicides, and that would be something like a neem oil. Azadirachtin is the active ingredient of products made from neem. And honestly, that active ingredient probably does more than just the overall neem oil. Synthetic chemicals, and these are allowed in organic rules, allow for some certain synthetics, and that would be like copper sulfate sprays, or sulfur sprays, or horticultural oils. If folks have questions about what would be allowed, organic rules are funny because they're built for farms. We have certified organic farms. Gardens don't really get certified, so products and fungicide products available to growers, the ones available to commercial growers who get licensed to apply them are a little stronger, potentially more dangerous than what's available to gardens. So the manufacturers don't always label the ones for gardeners as organic or not, but you can look for OMRI, is the Organic Materials Review Institute, and they sort of approve products as would be allowed for organic production or not. But the absence of that doesn't mean that a garden focused product wouldn't be, quote unquote organic, but of course it's not certified. So it's a lot open to interpretation. All right, that's back to our disease triangle. I think I maybe put this in here as a reminder to take a breath. And I do have specific diseases or common diseases that we can run through. I can't see anybody right now, but would that be the best use of our time to start doing some of that, or should we have a little more question and answer type discussion?
Let's see. I think I have time for 5 or 10 minutes, Caleb.
All right.
And then questions.
Common tomato diseases. We already touched on this a little bit, but these top two are early blight. The one on the right down here at the bottom is septorial leaf spot. It's a different disease than early blight, but I lump them together because management is going to be very similar. Late blight is the one that scares everybody, but it is much less common. It's more destructive potential, less ubiquity. So with early blight and septorial leaf spot, you see these little lesions. Each one is an infection site. Each one started off as a spore. And, by the time it's this big, it is creating spores that will then spread further on the plant. A dead leaf like this that has been well infected you know, if you were to grab that off your garden, parts of that leaf are going to fall and they'll be too small to pick up. That's where it's going to overwinter most commonly, is in that infected tissue. And you can see there's some different looks to it. The leaf tends to go yellow as a response. The leaf is trying to kill off that section. The plant's trying to kill off that section of the leaf to stop the disease from spreading. And when it gets bad, it can be really bad, right? Because it tends to be in the soil. That's one reason why we want to mulch as our control, so that we don't have heavy rains splashing those spores up into the plant. And it tends to work its way up a tomato plant as there's new infected spots making more spores, and they tend to then continue to splash their way up, but they can also be wind blown. It really all just depends on what is the environment around that plant. Is there enough moisture for those spores to take hold, as well as can you do something to prevent that initial population? If you start off the year with a lot of early blight, it's going to be really hard to avoid this kind of fate, just because there's so many more infected sites that are producing spores that could then continue the cycle. If you start off with just a little bit and you're able to have good conditions and the weather cooperates, you may not have any problems really. So that's a little bit of a repeat of what I just said. Crop rotation, right? It's only those infected leaves that fall to the ground. You clean up what you can, good sanitation, but there's still going to be some. If you can move your tomatoes a little bit away, it's going to make a difference. Healthy, vigorous plants, that's what cherry tomatoes can often outgrow early blight, just because they grow so darn fast. Stake plants to keep them up, helps the wind go through, helps them dry out a bit, also keeps them off the soil where a lot of those spores are starting from. Drip irrigation, that's watering, you know, or whether that's literal drip irrigation like the hosing you can buy, or whether it's just you being careful how you water and getting the water down to the soil, not to the leaves. Try to keep the leaves dry, and then mulch to help prevent those spores splashing up. Rye straw will actually reduce your incidence of early blight if you can get it around the plants early on. And I see a question about, would you remove infected leaves? If you are able to get out there as soon as you can, yes, I do that myself. It's one of the best ways to do it. When my cherry tomatoes have gotten this big, I sort of stopped bothering. Earlier on, you can see I've removed older dead leaves down here at the bottom. I didn't want them to become sources of inoculum to infect the rest of the plant. About this point in the year is when it starts to be too big of a task. And I also know I'm pretty much done, right? I don't need to keep trying this. This is also showing some genetic resistance in a way that you wouldn't expect. See how yellow this leaf is? That's because this variety is it resists the infection for a little bit, but once it gets infected, that plant is very quick to kill the leaf. Just like, boop, I don't want you to take me over, and it lets that leaf yellow and drop off. And so it's pulling nitrogen out of it, letting the leaf get yellow. So early septoria is going to be managed much the same way. It's just another early blight type disease. Late blight is the one that really scares us. 2009 was the bad year for all of New England. This one, when you see the sporulation, it's not actually a true fungus. It's what's called a water mold. It's a more primitive, well, that's a bad way to think of it. It branched off from fungus. It's like more closely related to bacteria and algae. But anyway, it's a fungus-like disease. It can be devastating when there's enough wet conditions, but spores are actually kind of wimpy. So in dry, sunny conditions, it doesn't spread very well. And you can see it can really just devastate the crop. It needs living tissue to overwinter where we live. And that's why we don't see it very often. The one area it can overwinter is in an infected potato. And that's one reason we don't want people to sort of save their own potato seed unless they're really sure that it is clean seed, that they don't have diseases in it. Because your late blight infected potato that you plant out next year, or germinates in, grows out of your compost pile, could become a real problem. It's uncommon, but it would be a concern for all of New England if someone overwintered late blight by accident. So the good news was, this we sort of extension has this great map. The website's down there on the right, usablight.org. We track what county late blight is in throughout the year, and you can watch that map yourself, but know that I'm also watching it, and I will put it into the pest report or do a special pest report just to let folks know it's a concern. I don't remember what year this was. That was maybe 2020. That was concerning. It was getting close, but the weather wasn't conducive to it, so we knew it wasn't really going to hit us. Last year, late blight did actually get into Maine, but at that point, the weather was not going to blow any of those spores from the north down to the south. And we didn't have any instances of it coming from the west or the south where our weather usually comes from. So in my pest reports, I mentioned if you live in the north, if you live in a rustic county, you would maybe want to be looking into it. But for the rest of the state, it's not a concern yet, and just keep our eyes on it. This is a disease that is more of a problem in commercial greenhouse production, but late blight and early blight, all that spore fall I was talking about, that's one reason to grow undercover. As soon as you put up a high tunnel or a greenhouse, you tend to make a very humid condition, especially if it's thickly populated by tomato plants. If you have a nice jungle of tomato plants, you're not getting as much airflow. And this is called leaf mold. The first symptom is just yellowing. What people notice first is these yellowing on the top of the leaf, and you flip it over and you get this kind of olivey, fuzzy sporulation. This is one for our growers where all I recommend is variety selection, because there are some varieties that are absolutely resistant to this. And if you grow a resistant variety, you essentially never see leaf mold. And then the other one is just try to maintain a good airflow, reduce that humidity. And it's one of those trade-offs. As we go to more protected growing, we see different diseases because different environments are conducive to different situations. This is another map available. This is the basil downy mildew map. Some of you may have seen basil downy mildew in your gardens. It looks very similar. It's a totally different type of disease. This is closer to late blight. It's one of those fungus-like diseases. It's not a true fungus, but it is very similar in that it is that fuzzy sporulation below the leaf. And it can, once you see that, make pesto as fast as you can, because it's not going to hurt you, but it's going to kill your plants. And that's one where disease-resistant varieties are newly emerging, and they are getting better each iteration. Each new variety that's been bred for disease resistance tends to be better than the last ones. And they aren't pure resistance like that leaf mold resistance, where it's if you have the right variety, you just don't get it. With basil downy mildew, it tends to be if you have the right variety, you don't get it for a long time or for longer. The disease can still overcome the resistance, but this buys you time. And it may mean if you get a little bit of disease when the conditions are right, and you can cut that out, and conditions are favorable, it's dry, it's sunny, you have good drying flow, you cut things back so there's more airflow, your plant may be able to regrow without getting infected again. I believe I already got into powdery mildew a bit. We can talk about it more later. Oh, this is why I put it in here. Know your disease, get it diagnosed. Experienced gardeners know that this is that same garden, by the way, a couple of years later. You can see the zucchini plant looks a lot happier and healthier. This is not powdery mildew, but I do get questions every couple of years of people seeing this, new gardeners, and fearing it's powdery mildew. This is just the way that some zucchini plant leaves look. And spinach downy mildew is a lot like basil downy mildew. And this is one where it is a race to get disease-resistant varieties as the disease itself continues to evolve and overcome those genetic resistances. But this is a bigger issue in winter growing. So farmers that are growing in high tunnels and greenhouses, not so much of an issue in our summer production because the environment tends to not be favorable for it, but a greenhouse environment tends to be conducive. Okay, so I'll take a drink of water. If folks need to email me, I am going to give you the warning that right now, due to PFAS questions that we are getting fast and furious, I do a lot of work directly with farmers. I have to prioritize my work with farmers. So gardener questions sometimes sit in my inbox for a little bit, but I can help diagnose things. If you have photos, particularly, that helps a lot to diagnose things. And if anyone uses Instagram, I occasionally post things on there. And the pest report, if you want to sign up again, there's that link.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was a super informative talk and a lot of hints we can all use. Let's try to run through some of these questions over the next, 10 or 15 minutes? We do have another meeting at 1:30, so we'll have to go off by at least quarter after. So the first question is from Mary. At the end of the year, I throw my diseased tomato plants into the woods about 20 feet from my garden. Will wind blow the disease back into the garden?
It's going to depend on the disease, but there is that potential, yes. When folks do that, I tend to recommend they're burying it maybe, or composting it, or maybe some people use a burn pile. When folks, the trick with composting is that our home composts tend to not get hot enough to kill things. It depends on what the disease is. Late blight, you have a late blight infected tomato, throw it wherever you want because the winter's going to kill the plant and the disease will be gone. A late blight infected potato, the tuber, you throw that into a compost pile, it may just be sheltered enough from the coldest weather that the potato actually survives and the late blight survives in it. So it's going to vary depending on what the disease is. But if you think about anything that does overwinter here, and it overwinters on infected tissue, if that infected tissue is just sitting there in the woods, it will be releasing spores.
Okay, so question whether that plant family map was in the Johnny's catalog or was it somewhere else?
Oh no, sorry, that was from elsewhere. I forget where I dug it up, but if you Google angiosperm phylogeny, and I'll write that out, you'll find it. I do love to look at how the different families have evolved and differentiated.
Okay, another question about cucumber beetles. Would you keep from getting cucumber beetles if you left your cucumbers in a greenhouse or maybe used a net?
So a lot of commercial growers do grow greenhouse cucumbers, and they exclude the cucumber beetles that way with netting over all the openings. It has to be over every opening to be effective. I've seen some commercial growers, I've done farm visits, and they said, oh yeah, no, I wasn't worried about that vent up there. I think they fly down low. And I said, okay, and flipped a leaf and I was like, here's your cucumber beetle. So it has to be thorough. The other issue is, of course, that you're also excluding beneficial insects and you're excluding pollinators. So in a commercial setting, they may bring in a bumblebee hive so that can do the pollination for them. They may also introduce some beneficial insects that are going to feed on pestish insects, right? Something that feeds on spider mites, because that can be an issue in greenhouses, or feeds on aphids, things like that. Or with cucumbers in particular, there are actually a lot of, I will throw this word in the chat as well, parthenocarpic varieties, which just means that they are going to bear fruit even if they're not pollinated. And that's more and more where people are going as they're doing more protected growing situations, and it's harder to allow easy access to pollinators. Yeah.
Okay, next question. Is there a way to cover certain plants but leave others uncovered for pollinators that may not be impacted the way as, say, the plants you want to eat? So I guess it's just a way of how do you distribute your row cover or whatever?
Yeah. So I do it very much based on which crops I have the most issues, excluding pests, right? Like I don't like to spray anything on my garden, and my brassicas are a magnet for flea beetles and different caterpillar pests. I also don't need my brassicas to be pollinated, so I leave row cover on them year round. Squash, I leave row cover on as long as I can. Sometimes I let the first blossoms open and I let them not get pollinated, allows the plant to devote its energy to get a little bit bigger. This is assuming I'm looking at the calendar, right? Like, do I have enough time for the plant to still make the fruit that I want it to make? And then I will remove the row cover when I need pollination to happen. And at that point, I pretty much don't put it back on. So it's really crop specific. If you have a diverse, like you're doing a lot of intercropping, it's harder to make those decisions. Or you could maybe make like a row cover type cage where you're just doing individual plants, but that would be an investment of your time and space, right? Where are you going to put that cage in the winter? But yeah, I try to leave things uncovered whenever possible, but it's a balancing act. I leave my brassicas covered all the way through harvest.
Yeah, flea beetles are a real problem sometimes. Just one other thing I learned about flea beetles is that if you leave the soil exposed during the winter so that you can get very strong freezing and thawing in the soil, it can kill the larvae. And that worked really well for me like the year before last after I'd had a huge infestation. Okay, next question. Is leafhopper burn something I can ignore or do I need to act on it?
That's one where variety selection is going to help you out. It depends. And there's not enough good information on which varieties are resistant or not, but it can affect a lot of different plants. The ones I see it in most are hopper burn in beans and in potatoes. They'll also get into like strawberries. And for a home garden, I would say I would ignore it on the strawberries. For beans, it's harder. It can kill them if there's enough leaf hoppers. Potatoes, it can kill them if there's enough. And it kind of depends on where you're at in the year. If the tubers are just about developed enough, it's okay if the tops die back, and then you let the tubers just harden up for storage with a dead top, even if it's not, you just may not get quite the yield that you were hoping for if they had lived the whole time. The other issue is that hopper burn doesn't show up until the leaf hoppers have already been feeding for a while. And if you wait until you see the symptom, you may not really be able to control them anyway. Because you can use row cover to exclude the leaf hoppers, but it doesn't matter if they're already there. And pesticides, you can use pyganic, which would have an impact on them, but then other ones are probably just going to show up. So if you were going to row cover, maybe pyganic first and then row cover. I think of that as a pesticide of last resort. Even though it's organically approved, it is pretty broad spectrum. And then I see that question was mostly about fruit trees, and I'm going to say that it's beyond my knowledge as to how I would imagine. I've never heard major issues of hopper burn in fruit trees, but fruit specialist may have. If you know CJ, ask CJ. Exactly.
So the next question, which I don't really understand. So Listo, do you want to ask your question about hail? If you can unmute.
Yeah, my question just regarding hail was, is there a way of like kind of tracking the weather and covering the plants that might be a way of preventing that damage, but sometimes you can never map when a storm is, and sometimes you can't get out there in enough time to cover your plants, just like not knowing how early the next frost is going to be.
Right. I think it's going to be, I don't think there's any great solutions, unfortunately. It's, pay attention to the weather forecast and know that any thunderstorm activity could produce some hail. The forecasters are getting a little bit better at predicting when a storm may be severe enough to produce hail. Was it this year that there were some real surprise hailstorms that caught a lot of us off guard? Unfortunately, there's not too much you can do. That one's pretty out of our control as far as I can tell. Although any row cover you have on already will protect plants quite a bit. Big enough hail may also shred that row cover, and you may have to buy new. The Protect Net would withstand most hail, I would think. It's pretty tough stuff.
So this next question you probably have answered. Corliss asks, should I be concerned about downy mildew on phlox that are a few feet from my raised vegetable beds?
Yeah, I think that was about powdery mildew, and
Yeah.
it.
Oh, that's right. It was yes, she corrected it later. That's
yeah,
right.
and most of the powdery mildews are very species specific. So I don't remember. Some of them will jump between some garden plants, but not many. I think the one that gets on lilacs doesn't get on phlox, and that doesn't get on tomatoes, and that doesn't. There's one that's only tomatoes. There's one that's only cucurbits. So it really is very species specific, but it does indicate they often do show up at the same time because it's favorable conditions for that disease. And that's one where I don't know if I directly said this, powdery mildew is one of the ones that actually doesn't need liquid moisture on the leaf surface. All it needs is high humidity. So those hot, humid days, it tends to show up. And it actually, that's one of the ones where rainfall can help wash away the spores. And it doesn't really do well in wet conditions.
Okay, next question. How do you define heavy mulch? I mulched the tomatoes with 6 inches of seaweed and still got some disease, not sure which.
I would define that as a very heavy mulch. It's one of those things that it's sort of using many hammers in your toolbox instead of one big hammer. And mulch is just one of the hammers. So you won't necessarily, just because you have mulch doesn't mean you're going to be free from disease. And there are some instances where it can actually create a more humid environment, right? And it may actually cause more problems. Usually for different diseases, like crown rots and root rots can become an issue with really heavy mulch.
Okay, my basil that I grew from seed got the gray mold. I did buy a 6-pack from a farmer as well, and I wonder how I got that mold when we both grew from seed.
So basil downy mildew, the reason I showed a map for it is that it is very much airborne, and it tends to work its way up the coast or up the country. So when it showed up in New Jersey, I think last year, I let folks know. And then before you knew it, it was in Massachusetts and it was in Maine. It has nothing to do with your seed source. It's really just, do you have a susceptible plant and does it show up on the wind? Ideally, we have good favorable weather conditions for the plants, not for the disease, and it doesn't show up, but there's always that chance.
Okay, I think we're at the end of the questions. I actually have one of my own, and that is about spinosad, which I try to use neem oil on stuff, but then it doesn't work, and I end up going to spinosad, which is supposedly registered organic and seems to do a really great job on things like flea beetles and aphids and that kind of stuff when I can't get rid of them any other way.
Yeah, spinosad it's a bacterial fermentation product. It is allowed in organic production. Entrust is the brand that commercial farmers can use. Home gardeners, unless you get licensed with the Board of Pesticide Control, you do not have access to that product. Hopefully you shouldn't be using it. But there are gardener specific versions.
Yes.
Captain Jack's Dead Brew I forget. There's a couple other ones.
Yeah, I think that's the one I've been using.
And it's another one where it's not specific to a specific pest. Like BTs tend to be specific to caterpillars or larval stages. And so you can use a BT and not have to worry about pollinators.
Yeah, BT is great.
But spinosad and pyganic are more broad spectrum. They won't always get everything, but the problem is that they may get pollinators. So we tend to encourage, spray that later in the evening when pollinators are no longer active, things like that. And for issues like spider mites, pyganic will knock them back and you'll kill that population for a little bit, but you never get everything. And that pyganic just killed a bunch of predators of spider mites, and the predators reproduce more slowly than the spider mites themselves. And so I can't point to the same exact thing with a spinosad, but for something like Colorado potato beetle, only spinosad's going to touch it. For cucumber beetle, spinosad won't touch it. They don't eat enough of the material. They won't do it. So again, it's going to be very species specific. You have to know your pest or your disease, and then learn from there what is going to be the most effective management.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we're at the end of our questions. There's some kudos in the chat, and I think it was a very informative, enjoyable presentation. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Caleb.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brenda. Yep.
Thank you all.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.